Welcome to the second part of this interview with Jeff Chadwick, and we're just going to jump right back in, and we think that there are more great things ahead, so thanks for joining us again. Okay, sorry, back to the inn, or
Well,
the inn. Yeah.
First of all, it says there was no room for them in the inn. The Joseph Smith translation, I think, adds a plural to that, which is fine. In Greek, it's singular. And either way, it doesn't matter. The word there is kataluma or katalumati, and the meaning is a guest chamber, a guest room. You didn't have hotels or motels or inns in little towns like Bethlehem. That great big notion of a caravanserai, right? A caravan hotel. Those actually may have existed in some very large areas, but there wouldn't have been one in Bethlehem. No. It wasn't a caravan stop. And you and I have visited that big caravanserai from the medieval period in Akko, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
A lower room for the animals and an upper room for the patrons, and there's a big central courtyard. And when 19th century New Testament writers would go to say like Frederick Farrar, for example, would go to Palestine and would see those things, they'd imagine that that's what was in Bethlehem, with an upper and lower room and a place for the animals out in the courtyard, and that there was no room in an upper kataluma for Joseph and Mary, so they had to be down when the animals were. That's why a manger was there. That's all actually, to be very kind, fun.
Yeah.
Just not what would have been in Bethlehem. They didn't have those caravanserais, and the kind that that Frederick Farrar saw or Alfred Edersheim would have been familiar with didn't even exist in Judea of that era.
Yeah. And it's certainly not in Bethlehem, which isn't as small as Nazareth, but it's still a small place. And it's close to Jerusalem. You just keep going to Jerusalem if you're at Bethlehem. But
yeah. But the thing is that people did have rooms in their homes that they would have available for guests.
And family was important in being hospitable to family. Yeah.
Right. But if the room was spare, you could get a room in some places if you were passing through. And this seems to be what Joseph had desired for Mary, was a guest room, which would be a more comfortable situation. But there simply wasn't one when her day came. By the way, I think they'd been there as long as 4 months prior to the birth. I'm going to come back to that. But when the time came for him to bear, there was simply no available kataluma. And so she has to bear where they were. And the child is laid in a manger. Now, where were they? The oldest tradition, which I think is correct, is in a cave.
Yeah.
In a grotto, a grotto with an opening toward the open air, on the very southern outskirts of what would have been Bethlehem town at that time, the very southeast scarp overlooking the wilderness, to the east. They would have been able to see out to the east a place called the Herodian, cone-shaped, artificially shaped hill where Herod had a grand country residence. But what were they doing out there? Not in the center of the city, we're closer, to where there were more houses and such. It is my supposition, and it is a supposition, but I think it's a logical one, that they were building a house.
Yeah.
That they had left Nazareth immediately after getting married, probably toward the end of Mary's 5th month, or maybe even during Mary's 5th month of pregnancy, just when it would be impossible to not notice, but also at a point where it's not impossible to walk 100 miles.
Yeah.
Especially with the assistance of a donkey. Although I'd rather walk than ride a donkey.
So would I, yeah.
But so this idea, at least in my mind, Kerry, of the the young couple, Joseph and Mary, arriving literally a day or two in Bethlehem before she's going to give birth, and desperately searching for an inn to stay in, and there not being one, is also part of the tradition that's not real. I think that knowing they had to go to Bethlehem, they moved immediately.
After and again, if they're trying to escape this stigma, that would make sense. You just go right away.
Right. Yeah. But then they go to Bethlehem, and what do? I assume that the reason Joseph is able to marry at this point is that he's saved some money. He's probably anywhere from 5 to 8 years older than Mary. Okay. If she's 17, I imagine him as 25. Some people have imagined older, but I don't think so. I know something about the culture then. And a young man would want to be married in his 20s. And he'd been working for a long time. He was a well-taught mason for sure. He was a carpenter, a tekton in Greek.
Yeah, builder. Yeah.
He would have saved up a dowry. He would have saved up a dowry, and that dowry, is usually said to be paid to the parents, but that's not really so much the case. In most society, the dowry, which is the notion of being given to the parents, is then bestowed by the parent upon the bride.
Yeah. It's so the bride can be taken care of.
The dowry is raised so that you can start marriage with something. Okay? And so he was ready with some money. When they left Nazareth to go and register in Bethlehem, I suppose with a fair amount of certainty, the first thing they did was look for a place to build, because they want to live there. And there wasn't a real estate market. People didn't buy and sell houses in the day that we do now. I mean, we know people bought and sold houses, but it wasn't done in the way we do it today. Places where you lived were places where families had lived for centuries. And there wouldn't have been a robust available house market that Joseph could have taken advantage of in Bethlehem. There wasn't any Century 21 there to help out. And besides that, if there's one thing Joseph can do, because he's a tekton, because he's a builder, he can build a house.
Yeah.
And what you need to build a house is everywhere, stone.
Yep. Yeah, it's not hard. You don't have to go out and buy wood or whatever else. There's stone everywhere.
What he needs is a place to build. And so I imagine that upon arriving in Bethlehem and maybe staying in a Kataluma for a few nights, upon arriving maybe in July or so, what I imagine is that they got some property, and they got property that is available, which would have been away from the center of the village, some property that was closer to a more open area. And that would mean that if you buy that property, you can build on it, and stone is available because it's not in a built-up area. So I imagine that Joseph bought a dunam, a quarter acre
parcel,
and that he began to build a house. Now, so what's with the cave? Well, as well as I do, that the limestone hillsides of Judea are pocked with natural caves
everywhere.
It's a Cenomanian limestone structure, and there are caves everywhere. They just occur naturally.
Yep.
And so I'm pretty sure that on Joseph's property were a couple of caves. And what couple of caves I think they were: the grotto of the Nativity and the milk grotto. But they choose one, and this I think would have been the grotto of the Nativity, and they're going to live in that cave while Joseph is building a house. And so they buy this land, and they start. It's summer when they get there. They set up house in a grotto with an opening to the outside, and Joseph begins to build the house very close to the grotto.
Yeah, and that's common to have your house by the cave that you'll use for other purposes.
Because they're not that great actually for stabling, contrary to what some people say, because animals get hurt in rough situations. But what they are great for is storage.
Mm-hmm.
They're great for all kinds of things that you want to store in a constant temperature, whether it's wine, whether it's foodstuffs you're saving over.
Grain.
Apples, for example, and apples they had. Grapes don't last, but wine does, and you can make them raisins, and also stores of wheat do much better in a cave store
or barley. Yeah.
So yeah, having a cave there is great, but the cave is best because they can live in it while you're building the house. Yeah. Now, how many times have you seen, and I see it all the time in Utah, that someone will buy some land in a rural area and live in a trailer while they're building the house?
Yep.
And by the way, and this goes back to before I knew you very well, going back to the 80s, I knew a family, a Palestinian family, that was living in a cave in Sheikh Jarrah, in what's called Shimon HaTzadik. It's a little kind of a depression area there, that is still not very well settled, right there in the middle of Jerusalem. And there was a natural cave there. And one time in the 80s, I noticed there's a Palestinian family living there. And I thought, oh, this poor family. There were like electrical cords going into this cave from a building that was nearby. And as I went down in there, just curious, I noticed that the family had tables in there, a couch in there, there was a television set in there, there were fans in there, there was a refrigerator in there, and they were living there. And when they asked what I was doing there, I said, I just was wondering why you're living in a cave. And he smiled and said, oh, that's my house I'm building right over there. And this is in the middle of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And so that got me to thinking, okay, so maybe living in a cave is so impossible. I'm pretty sure that Joseph and Mary were living in what would be temporary circumstances in this grotto while Joseph is building a house. And here's the deal. When December comes around, it's been 4 months since they've arrived in Bethlehem, if my timing is correct. The house isn't done. The walls are probably up, and but maybe the roof's not on or whatever, and they're still living in the grotto. And in order that Mary might have a more comfortable place than the grotto to deliver, Joseph seeks a kataluma, a guest house in town, but none's available. So she births in the grotto, and the babe is laid in a manger. I'm pretty sure that Joseph would have had a trough or two carved out of stone. In fact, that would have been the first thing he would have done, because they almost certainly came to Bethlehem with a donkey. They would have packed what they had and brought it with them from Nazareth. But secondly, they would probably have obtained a goat or two, because they're good for milk. They may have had some chickens. Okay? They may even have a little dovecote outside, so maybe they could get dove's eggs as well. But there wouldn't have been any camels, and I doubt they owned a cow. They were far too expensive, and they don't do well in Bethlehem. Goats were better. And so maybe he had a low manger, a low trough and a high trough, one a little bit bigger and taller for the donkey, and one a little bit lower for the goat. But a stone trough was available to be used.
Because you have to get water to those animals right away. You can't wait on that.
Yeah, no, they have to be watered every day, fresh every day, which was probably what Mary got to do. She probably got to go. There are, by the way, springs right there in what we call the Manger Square area. So she didn't have to go into David's Well in the center of town to get water. In fact, that might have been one of the things that was good about Joseph's land, is it might have had a little water on it. That now, of course, is part of the Bethlehem water supply. But they had what they needed, and but there in a dry stone trough, Jesus is laid on that night that he's born in a cave that wasn't a stable where they were living, while the house, which wasn't done yet, was still being built. And so you have this very simple nativity scene, if you will, a cave on a December night when it's cold outside, not freezing, but cold the way it would get, say, if you were in San Diego on a winter's night. And Inside the cave is lit by a couple of oil lamps, those Herodian oil lamps we know, because Joseph has carved niches in the cave wall for them. There's a bed. There are some baskets and chest baskets of their clothing and other belongings. There's probably a little clay stove that's been built so that they can heat their food, cook their food, and also it offers heat to the inside of the cave. But it's a very simple setting. A couple and a new baby in a dimly lit cave with the babe lying in a manger. That's your original manger scene. And it's lovely in its simplicity and its faith and its strength.
I couldn't agree more. That's how I have come to picture Christmas. I still love all of my nativity sets that I have with stables and everything else, and I love all of them, and they all make me feel Christmassy. But when I think about the Savior, the scene you just described, when I think about the condescension of God on that night, the great Jehovah, that element of there are several elements of the condescension of God as described in Nephi's vision, but one of them is Jehovah being born of a mortal woman as a little baby. And when I think
simplest of circumstances, simplest of circumstances.
That's exactly the picture that I have in my mind.
Now, here's the rest of the story, right? When those shepherds are told a mile or so away, out in those fields east of Bethlehem that you and I have taken hundreds of students to and sat with them in the evening and told this story. When those shepherds are visited by the angel that tells them to go over to Bethlehem and look for a babe in a water trough, that's a pretty specific sign. There's not going to be another baby in town laying in a stone manger.
Yeah.
So, but they don't know any more than that. You know, they don't have an address. It's not on Google Maps for them. So when they arrive in Bethlehem in the middle of the night, and they didn't bring their sheep with them, okay?
Yeah.
But they go up the hill from those fields that are much lower, and they go up the hill into Bethlehem. And they're going from house to house, waking people up in the middle of a winter night, saying, "Do you happen to have a baby lying in a trough?" And I can imagine people being very perturbed at this.
Yeah.
Until the shepherds tell them, "We've been told by an angel that the child we're seeking will be the Messiah." And so what I imagine is that some people said, "Oh, you're crazy," but other people said, "Really? Really?" But I can imagine them waking everybody up in the village, because they would have gone to the more populous part of the village before going to the outskirts. And so it's only maybe after someone tells them, "Well, there's this new couple that lives to the south of here, another 300 meters. And she was about to have a baby." And so when they finally get there, after waking a lot of people up and see the child in a manger, they know. So I imagine that Joseph and Mary are very alarmed and suspicious at this. But when they say, "Oh, an angel told us to look for a baby in a manger," they've had enough experience with angels to know that it's okay. And after the visit, notice what it says in Luke 2, right? Luke 2:17, "Those shepherds, when they had seen it, made known abroad the saying which was told them concerning this child." It means they went back into town and told people that they'd roused it up. "We found him, we found him, we found him." And verse 18 says, "All they that heard it wondered at these things which were told them by the shepherds." So Bethlehem, all of a sudden, in the early hours, is abuzz with these shepherds who have come back and said, "We have found the child the angel told us was the Messiah." And what I imagine is is that Joseph and Mary got quite a few visits
Hmm.
the next morning.
I hadn't thought of that, but that would make sense.
I imagine then that they got visits for days and days afterward of people bringing food, bringing napkins, bringing other things this couple would need. When it says in verse 19, Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. I wonder if that included an effusive interest by the neighborhood. Isn't it amazing what if you look at the text and put it into real circumstances, what would people do in this circumstance, especially when we now know this, that the shepherds told them they'd found the child. Wouldn't you go see him?
Yeah. Yep.
So, now, back up just a little bit. Back in Matthew 2, when we read that Jesus was born in the days of Herod the Great, and that these Magi, right, these wise men come seeking Jesus, and they visit with Herod in Jerusalem. And Herod doesn't know anything, so he asks the Jewish scholars who say Bethlehem. And so the wise men come to Bethlehem, and they find the family in a house. It said in Matthew, in the house, and they take out their gifts and worship. So the house is done.
Yeah.
By the time the wise men are there, I imagine the house was done within a month of Jesus' birth. And what I imagine there is that all of a sudden Joseph might have had a lot of people willing to help get that roof on.
And kind of kick it into gear and get it going. Yeah.
But this then begs the whole deal of the wise men. So just to finish up Luke 2, a couple of more things happen. 8 days later, Jesus is circumcised and given the name, and Joseph names him Yeshua, Jesus. So that's a week. 5 more weeks pass, so that 6 weeks in all, 40 days, and they take the child to the temple in Jerusalem. And so we're into February now. We're into mid-February, early mid-February. And you know how beautiful February is.
Yeah.
The grass is blossoming. The days are warmer. You're going to have temperatures sometimes even as high as the 70s. Sunshiny days amid other days that are raining like crazy on you. Billions of beautiful wildflowers in the hillsides. Red, blue, yellow, white, purple.
Orange, yeah.
And going to Jerusalem, going up what was finished of the south end stairs, going through the tunnel into the temple, the 2 doves offered as a sacrifice, and then Simeon and Anna and the wonderful things there. By the way, if I may, that Joseph and Mary offered 2 doves for Jesus is not an indication of poverty. This is a very common thing that gets taught among us. I've even heard it from pulpits. Just not the case. That was the standard offering for a new child. The law of Moses stipulates that you could offer an animal for the child, but also 2 doves. And the stipulation of an animal is something that virtually no one could have afforded but the most wealthy.
So that's what I would say is it's an indication that they're not really wealthy.
It's an indication that what we can say about them is that they're working class people. They're not poor. By the way, they're not homeless. There's not a point ever in that story until after the wise men leave that they will be homeless, okay? They're not homeless when they come to Bethlehem. They are between homes with the intention of getting a home, which they get very quickly. And they're building a new home. They're not refugees. So the whole idea of being refugees at the time Jesus is born is misapplied.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're in a way refugees when they go to Egypt, but
well, yeah, but that's we haven't come to that. You know, that's where circumstance does get them. Okay?
Yep.
But up until now, they're not victims of circumstance, and in fact, they've been highly favored. I think, even though they're working class people. And if you're thinking, well, okay, Joseph, what would he have worked at? Well, he is an expert mason. Mm-hmm. And in addition to building his home in Bethlehem, 5 miles away, that's an hour and a half walk. That's what I commute, by the way, is an hour and a half to Provo. Mm. I live in Weber County. I don't live in Utah County. People say, my goodness, that's a long commute. I say, that's my short commute because my other commute is a flight to Tel Aviv.
Yeah, that's right. And I used to live in Southern California. For a lot of people, that would be a short commute still. So anyway, yeah.
But the biggest building project in the world, which needed skilled stonemasons, was going on as the complex of the Temple of Herod was still underway and would be underway for decades to come. I'm absolutely certain Joseph worked on the Temple of Herod. Absolutely certain. That because
it would just naturally follow.
He could make 2 dinars a day, okay, as a skilled mason, and that's enough to live on. And that's also enough, along with the gold that the wise men had brought, to finance what would be their flight to Egypt.
Yeah.
So after 40 days, they go to the temple. And then it's not long after that I imagine the wise men arriving. I know people are very tuned in to the wise men not coming for 2 years later, but I'm certain that's not correct. And I'm certain that they were there by the end of February. And that by the end of February, Joseph and Mary have had to leave their new house in Nazareth, in Bethlehem, and to flee to Egypt to keep themselves safe.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And if we talk about that Egypt trip, maybe I could just speculate on that for a minute.
Well, you're an Egyptian guy, so I would have expected you to have something to say about this. Let's go.
Well, and people ask about it all the time. And of course, we don't know. If you go to Egypt today, there are like 200 or more places that have a tradition that, well, baby Jesus was here and this miracle happened or something. But in fact, we have no idea where he went in Egypt. But if I put myself in their shoes, I would think what I want is to find a Jewish community to live with. That makes it easier to keep kosher laws, to go to synagogue, all these things that you would want to do. And so I've done a lot of study about where are Jewish communities at the time.
It can only be one place, can it?
Yeah, well, there are actually a number, but so it kind of depends. So now I'm curious to see what you say. But
if you were a stonemason looking for building projects in a Jewish community, where would you go?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a Jewish community right very soon after you enter into Egypt along the Delta, coming in on that eastern side, the northeastern side, coming in where you would from Israel, where there's huge building projects at the time, right there in that northeastern Delta area. So I don't know if that's where you're thinking.
Okay, so you and I actually think a different area. Okay.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure where you were thinking, but
I was thinking Alexandria.
Well, that is possible.
Alexandria had a huge Jewish population.
There is a giant. So that's the question. And I have thought of that. The question is, did they just go to where it was easiest? And they get to a Jewish community there on the eastern Pelusiac branch there and say, okay, we found a Jewish community and we're done? Or did they go to where the largest Jewish community is with tons of buildings, like tons and tons and tons of building, and that would be Alexandria, right? Yeah. So that's that's on the other side of the
that's on the western side of the Delta, yeah.
Yeah, so they would have to travel there.
I'd always thought, you and I have been to Cairo, and we've been down to the old quarter there where they have all those traditions in Cairo, and I don't imagine that that's a possibility, really. But if I look to a couple that wants to disappear, right? Alexandria is a good place to disappear among lots and lots and lots of Jews with lots of building projects going on. So
That's a good point. So there are a couple of ways.
I'm not absolutely sure about Alexandria, but that's one of the places I would have thought would be most logical.
It makes sense. I think you can disappear.
It's also further away from Herod.
That is true, which is nice, and it's a place that Caesar has his eye on, and Herod's going to have to stay out of.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Herod's no way Herod can go into Alexandria.
Well, I think Egypt is safe no matter where they would have gone in terms of Herod's interference. But Herod, and here's the thing: when I model this story in Matthew 2, I don't think that Herod sent soldiers to Bethlehem. I know this is the way that it's modeled, but I don't think so. First of all, Josephus does a very good job chronicling the end months of Herod's life and everybody that hated him for every bad thing he did.
Yeah, and there were plenty.
There were plenty, but specifically in the last months of his life, there were some Jewish men that had rebelled against him, hanging some golden eagles at the Temple Mount.
Yeah,
and he had them executed, and he had various people executed, and this caused riots. Okay, and these executions were well known. Every Jew knew that this had happened. That this atrocity that Herod had done was well chronicled in the history. In the other Jewish histories, there's no mention of babies being killed by Herod's agents at Bethlehem. And I cannot imagine that if Herod had had this thing done publicly, it wouldn't have been mentioned in Josephus.
Yeah, or and some other sources.
I think it was a black ops job. That Herod had agents that did secret assassinations, secret killings, and that this is how the children of Bethlehem. I don't imagine that there would have been more, maybe, than a dozen or so that were actually killed. But
Bethlehem's not that big.
I actually write a whole chapter about this in Stone Manger. That Herod called in people that he had do his dirtiest work to keep it, strictly unknown.
And he did that kind of thing.
And that this wouldn't have happened all on one night. It would have been too coincidental that 12 babies are killed in a violent way on one night, but that it's done over a period of time so that any family that had a baby winds up having a break-in in which the child is killed. And it's like made out to be a crime spree in Bethlehem that is horrible but coincidental, and only in time, right? Because Joseph and Mary will return to Nazareth and say they had to escape from Herod. Did the gospel writer Matthew put two and two together? Understand, probably through other sources. We know, by the way, that some people that served in Herod's government became members, right? Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's servant, Herod's steward, became a follower of Jesus. So in time, all this old 25, 30-year-old Herodian goings on would have come out. So Matthew was aware of something that Josephus might not have included because he might have considered it a conspiracy theory.
Interesting.
That's why I think that this very horrible atrocity in Matthew 2 doesn't show up in Josephus, is because there was some question about how it had happened because it wasn't public record. Whereas the executions Herod had made that had caused so much, public dissent in his last months were public record, and Josephus knew of them. But in any case, I think it was a black ops job killing the babies of Bethlehem, and I write it more fully. But that's why I think it is real. The scriptures are telling something true, but it doesn't appear in the history.
Hmm. I hadn't, and I've read your book, but I still don't remember thinking about that. But yeah, and maybe just to continue on a little bit with that story for our audience, many of them won't know, but because of both Julius Caesar's involvement in Alexandria, but in Egypt, and then Mark Antony's involvement in Egypt. And so Caesar Augustus feels that Egypt is a spot that easily can turn against him. And it's so important because of its grain. He takes special measures to make it a protected area. I don't know if it's by this time or a few years later, but around this time, he'll say no senators can go there and so on. He has a special eye on Egypt, and it's a place where other people just can't mess around with that. And so it's the perfect, of course, it's the closest place to flee to for Mary and Joseph, but it's also the perfect place to flee to because there's no way that Herod is going to send anyone to do anything there. And so they can disappear in a little town on that eastern branch, or they can disappear in the huge groups of Jews over in Alexandria. But one way or the other, they go there and they disappear, and Joseph has work that he can do.
Right. And I note in verse 13 of Matthew 2 that it's God's direction that sends them to Egypt,
Right.
because it might have been actually easier to flee somewhere else, like maybe
Moab. Yeah,
where Herod didn't hold sway, but
and
God
again,
that sends him to Egypt, and Matthew finds a prophetic fulfillment there, right out of Egypt. If I call my son, so it's great.
Yeah.
Now
there's another fun little thing for our audience to think of that where people go for Petra today, right? It's a big tourist attraction. Indiana Jones and his father go there in the Last Crusade and so on. But anyway,
Southern Jordan, right?
Petra. Yeah, Southern Jordan was at that time. Many of the structures that people go and see today were being built at that time by this group that the Nabateans that were there was some tension between them and the Herodian kingdom as well, and so that is a place that he could have gone to flee. Well, there were some intermarriages and some tension, and some of it gets worse a little bit after this. But anyway, that's a place he could have gone. But as you said, and it probably is easier, but God tells him to go to Egypt. So
right, and there would have been any number of caravans once they left Bethlehem, which I think they did in the middle of the night, and they come down the road. They're probably going to go down the Elah, which means they'll pass Gad, right?
Yeah,
they're going to probably catch a caravan that's heading down the coast and going to go across the northern Sinai and
what's called the Way of Horus.
They'll pass through El Arish, they'll pass through Pelusium, they'll pass through all those places that we're familiar with. Especially in the old days when we used to ride the bus to Egypt. Remember that? In the northern
and they would go that same way. So
I went that way alone one time. One year I had a tour, and this was in the 80s. I took him to Israel, I took him to Egypt, and then I sent the tour home, and I had to go back to Israel to work. And the way that I did it was to charter an Egyptian bus to across the northern Sinai that left Cairo. So I was all alone,
Just you and the bus driver, huh?
Well, it was a bunch of other people, but mostly weren't tourists. And so I went all the way to El Arish, and then all the way to the Israeli border at Gaza, crossed over there, and
at Gaza.
At Gaza, yeah.
This was a while ago then.
Yeah, so this was in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And then of course came into Israel, and then made my way back up to Jerusalem in the very same way that probably Joseph and Mary did. And so I'll always remember that, traveling on my own, relying on someone else's caravan, or their bus to get back to the Holy Land. Well, if I could just for a moment, let me address this 2 years and under thing.
Okay.
First of all, in Matthew 2, we read in verse 1, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? Now, there is an immediacy in that passage. When he's born, the Magi come. There's no indication in that passage of waiting. It's only when you get down to verse 16, after Joseph and Mary have left Bethlehem to go to Egypt, that Herod, when he saw he was mocked by the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth, doesn't say his forces, right? He just sends agents, and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and all the coasts thereof. Now notice that, not just in the city, but in the surrounding area of Bethlehem, right? Because, you know, this is this goes back to the notion of registration. That Bethlehem encloses an area around it. From 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Now, that diligently inquired is also over in verse 7, when the wise men visit Jerusalem and visit Herod, and he's saying, what do you mean, new king? That's me, I'm the king. Right? It says he inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I'm not sure he got good intelligence from the wise men. But if he did, okay, it would probably have been that the star had appeared, you know, recently in the last couple of months. So when you get over to verse 16, that diligently inquired is a question. Because if he's really found out from the wise men when the star appeared, why is he killing children 2 years and younger?
Yeah.
Why not kill the ones just 2 years old or the ones younger?
Yeah, or just the ones 1 year old or whatever.
In other words, Herod really doesn't know when that star appeared, or at least what the wise men have given him is not something that he's sure enough of. So rather than this being a time which points to Jesus having been born 2 years earlier, what it says to me is that Herod is hedging his bet.
Yeah.
He's simply setting a real upper limit on what the age is that this child could be. And what I suspect is that the child was actually born just 8 weeks before, you know, the wise men arrived. Because if they see a sign in the east, and I'm assuming they're in Babylon or maybe in Persia.
Yeah, that seems to be our two best candidates.
I assume they're Jews. I assume they're Jewish mystics, which would be the word Magi, Persian. And because how else would they know of a king that would be born of Judah and that a star would be associated with this? I mean, because the only prophecy about that is in Numbers 24, right? Star shall rise out of Judah. Right. And how would they know Jewish scripture? Why would they care? Why would it matter to them unless they're Jewish?
Yeah.
But this means all kinds of things to them. Now,
and there are plenty of Jews in Babylon and Persia. Plenty.
Now you can ask, why don't they know Matthew 5:2? But the one thing about that is that a king would be royalty. And so the first place that they would go is, Jerusalem, where the royalty is.
Yeah.
So I don't think that they didn't know Bethlehem, but that probably wouldn't have been the first thing that they would have thought of. Especially since they're in the winter, and they, as Jewish mystics, they're a little outside the normative synagogue tradition, I guess is the way to put it. So maybe they hadn't been around the previous summer when the Haftarah from Micah was read or whatever. But the immediacy of verse 1 suggests to me they came as soon as possible. And what does it take to travel on foot from Babylon or from Western Persia to Jerusalem?
I don't know.
It can take 6-7 weeks. Yeah, that's the travel time. It's further to then go to Egypt. Okay? It's 2 weeks to get to Egypt if you're traveling every day. But it's 3 times the distance to go up through the Fertile Crescent, especially from the because it's way in the south of the Mesopotamian area. And if you're in Persia, it's another week. So if you see the sign in the east, and you're a Jewish magush, right? You're a Jewish mystic. I mean, actually, magi is the word magician.
Mm-hmm.
So Harry Potter fans shouldn't feel bad.
There you go.
These were three wizards coming, I guess. But they didn't, have power. They were just hooked into natural phenomena and
right,
how
studying the stars.
Today we would call this Kabbalah today.
Yeah.
So what they do when they see this sign is they get ready and then they leave. Now, how long does it take to get ready for a trip that far? You're going to have to outfit yourself for a few days, a week,
and
then
you gotta
leave.
get your gifts. So how hard was it for them to get the frankincense or whatever? We don't know, but
well, yeah, you can buy that anywhere. You can buy it on the way too. But whatever it is, they get ready for a week and then they leave, so that 6 weeks later, right? They'll be arriving in Jerusalem maybe the 7th week after Jesus is born, and then come to Bethlehem a day or two after. So it's in Jesus' 8th week of being alive, which means he's been circumcised. He went to the temple at 6 weeks, and within 10 days to 2 weeks, the wise men arrived there, and this would be late February, and they give their gifts. Joseph becomes alarmed. The wise men are obviously alarmed because they don't go back to Herod. They clearly sense that something's wrong. Okay? And so they depart. And verse 12 says they were warned of God in a dream. I have a suspicion that they shared that alarm with Joseph, and that Joseph's dream then tells him what to do about it. Go to Egypt.
Right.
But in any case, they leave, and so by the end of February, Joseph and Mary are leaving their new house that they've invested everything in. They're leaving their plans that Jesus should grow up in Bethlehem. And everything they've tried to do is now in danger of being blown to pieces for them. Yeah. And they now are victims of circumstance, and they now will become refugees, technically seeking refuge somewhere else. Yep. They'll probably have some means to do it. The gold would help them. But I imagine they've spent a lot of money getting the house done, so that for Joseph to work in Egypt is going to be a very important factor in their survival, which is why wherever they were along the Med coast there of Egypt, along the Delta coast, there has to have been work for Joseph.
Yeah.
And then, so they're there, and they're safe. And then over the next while, okay, babes of Bethlehem, one by one, are killed by dark agents whom Herod has sent. Joseph and Mary escape all of this. So that when things are safe again, and by the way, in my book Stone Manger, I write what happens in the aftermath of Herod's death. There were, for 6 or 7 months after Herod's death, terrible military upheavals in Judea and Galilee that ravaged the population. Thousands were killed. And so Herod's death in 4 BC, in April, a month and a half after Joseph and Mary would have gone to Egypt, wasn't the point at which Joseph and Mary returned.
Right.
I suspect that they would have, or that the angel of advising them would have waited until all danger was past. Now, the key to that is that we see, right, in verse 22, that Archelaus was reigning.
Yeah.
And Archelaus actually solidified his reign after that 6 or 7 months of terror that happened in the spring, summer, and fall of the year 4 BC throughout Judea. Yep. So with Archelaus reigning, that's when Joseph and Mary make their return, because in verse 19 it says the angel told them, verse 20, he's dead that sought the child's life. Verse 20, return to the land of Israel. Verse 21, Joseph does so. He takes the mother and the young child, returns to the land of Israel. But verse 22, when they hear that Archelaus is reigning, that tells you it's probably November, December of 4 BC, as at the earliest that they can have been returning.
Right.
Probably a year from Jesus' birth.
And it's probably not that long after Archelaus starts to reign, because it seems like it's a little bit of news to them that he's reigning.
Yeah. And
I think it highlights what you were talking about earlier. Their intent was to return to Bethlehem. Yeah, that's where they were planning to go.
And that's what it says. They wanted to go back to Judea. But when they hear Archelaus reigns in Judea, and they get the warning from God not to go there, they default to the Galilee, and Jesus grows up in Nazareth. But it clearly had been their intention to return to Judea, and they had to be told not to do it. And why did they want to return to Judea? Because it was their intent to live in Bethlehem, go back to that house that they had left. And
he probably still technically owns that house.
Oh, right? Sure. He probably has the deed.
Yeah.
He probably has the deed. You would have the deed.
Yep.
And I'm pretty sure that friends in Bethlehem that they had made during that several months would have seen to it that the house wasn't, appropriate. But in any case, they wind up taking Jesus back to Nazareth. And in this situation, they were the victims of circumstance. But again, it's God's circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Because God meant for Jesus to grow up in Nazareth as, and here's the deal, Kerry, right? We can think and we can be faithful and be successful in being anxiously engaged to do what we think needs to be done to bring God's plan to fruition, which is what Mary and Joseph did when they moved to Bethlehem. The baby was born where it was supposed to be. But does it say that the Messiah will grow up in Bethlehem?
No.
So their assumption gets shortchanged by God's understanding that this child was going to grow up in Nazareth, even though it would be born in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And they come to understand that gradually, right? Because Matthew writes in verse 23, he dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets. Okay? He should be called a Nazarene. But they didn't know that going to Bethlehem. It's only after the fact that
they can say, "Oh, hey."
Again, the intent becomes more clear.
Yeah.
So it's a remarkable story. And by the way, everybody I think by now knows, and I talked about this at length previously, that the prophecy in verse 23 is a specific reference to Isaiah 11 and the Netzer, right? That Jesus would be a Notzri from Nazareth, that Jesus would be a Nazarene from Nazareth, and the Netzer in Isaiah 11, one is branch.
Yeah.
He's the branch, the Messiah branch.
And then you get that phrase being used to
see that in here because in Greek, of course, in Greek the Nazarene doesn't really translate over to the Netzer in Hebrew, Isaiah 11. So a lot of people won't know that that's not a lost scripture; it's just lost in translation here.
Yeah,
but it's Isaiah 11:1 is what's being referred to in Matthew 2:23, along with a couple of passages in Jeremiah and Zechariah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We get in both of those prophets, they say they talk about a branch. Right. That is the son of David, or the messianic king. Right. And so it's a phrase that is associated with the Messiah, which is really interesting because that is what Nazareth means. It's
now in Jeremiah they say tzemach, and in Zechariah they say tzemach, which is a synonym of netzer, right? It's like saying branch and limb.
Yeah.
but because Nazareth actually is derived from the Hebrew word branch, netzer. The name Nazareth means branchville.
Yep. And I think Jeremiah and Zechariah, while they're using a different word, are drawing on the Isaiah prophecy.
Sure, absolutely. But the bottom line is that of all the branch prophecies in the Old Testament, the one that Isaiah specifically, Matthew specifically referred to is Isaiah 11:1.
Yeah, I agree.
And so Jesus was a branch guy, right? A branch guy. He was a Branchvilleite.
Yeah, there you go.
A Nazarene. Interestingly enough, in Hebrew, the way you say Christian is to say Notzri, Nazarene.
Yeah. Yep.
It's kind of fun. So everything worked out as it should. But here again now, Joseph and Mary in Nazareth, back among family, though, who must have been glad to receive them and glad to see this beautiful new boy who's now a year old by the time they arrive, that they hadn't been able to see before, right? And they have family support there. And yeah, people can think that he was conceived before they were married. Let them think what they will. There is a hint, by the way, in John that people actually have remembered that it was thought that Jesus was conceived out of wedlock. Right? In John, there's that passage where the Sadducees say, "We be not born in fornication." They're clearly trying to throw that at Jesus. I suspect that didn't disappear, but because of what Luke 2 says about him growing up in favor of God and man, it's clear that he had a good childhood in Nazareth, and that's where he was supposed to be.
Yep. Well, that's good stuff. We have
blown to pieces the traditional Christmas story here. It wasn't 2 years old and younger. Jesus, the wise men came to Jesus 8 weeks after he was born. It wasn't a wood box full of hay. It was a stone trough that was used for water. They weren't looking for a room in a hotel or a motel or an inn. They were looking for a guest room, but it didn't work, and the birth happened in the grotto that they were living in while Joseph was building the house that the wise men would find Luke 2. And even though it's a different way of telling the story than we have received through tradition over centuries, this is the more real version that's in the scripture. And to me, it's more beautiful, and it's more accurate, and it's something that shouts the scriptures are real.
Mm-hmm. I agree. In fact, that's the perfect place to end. It really does. When you look at the realia of the time and you look at the story, the scriptures are real. And maybe it's just a good time to testify that the great Jehovah did come and was born of a virgin in Bethlehem, and literally thank God for that.
And as you're doing that, let me point out there are 3 Christmas stories in the New Testament. One's in Matthew, one's in Luke, but then the most simple and divine one that you just quoted is in John 1. Mm-hmm. John 1, verse 14. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us.
Yep.
The great Jehovah, the God that stood with the Father as a premortal Jehovah Spirit, comes to earth and was made flesh and dwelt among us. And John 1:14, we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And of that, I bear my testimony with you.
Amen. Well, thank you, Jeff. I'm so grateful. I hope that this is helpful for our audience, and that if they found it helpful, they'll share it with some other people, and that I think we're off to a great start for this New Testament year and making the life of the Savior real and powerful in our lives. So thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome. It's been great to be with you for 2 hours. My old deep-voiced friend from Jerusalem and beyond. We'll see you on the other side.
Sounds good.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.